Welcome. We've got an all-star group of people. I'm Benjamin Singer, the Executive Director of Show Me Integrity. Very excited to be here with Business for America. So welcome, everyone. We've got a jam-packed and really exciting and star-studded agenda, so we're going to keep it rolling. Again, I'm Benjamin Singer, the Executive Director of Show Me Integrity, and Show Me Integrity is a state-based partner for Business for America, a national organization, helping lead the business community for good government. You'll hear more directly from their leadership. So I want to start with the stakes of why we're here today, the stakes for businesses and for our country. We have the chance very scarily of destabilizing our economy and this pandemic even more, or with the leadership that businesses can help provide, we can get this pandemic under control and we can stabilize our nation and our economy. What's really exciting here in Missouri is that of anywhere in the nation, we have the biggest opportunity to shape the future of the country right now. We've been approached by national and state leaders, including Business for America, to work together to help make this happen for one big reason. And the eyes of the country are watching what we're doing here in Missouri with Business for America and Show Me Integrity because of our senior senator, Senator Roy Blunt, and his chairmanship of the Rules Committee in the U.S. Senate, which will determine the future of this critical issue we're talking about today of safe, secure, credible elections and the future of our country. So we're very proud of this national and state-based partnership and this good coordination that we have happening. So the call agenda, you're going to hear from Clerk Scholler, again, former Speaker of the Missouri House. You'll hear from Bonk and Richard, the leaders at Business for America. You'll hear from Mark Burgess, the owner of Burgess Aircraft Management, from a business perspective of why these changes that you're going to hear about, why this is so critically needed for businesses in our economy, and from Sarah Schlafly about why, as a business leader, this is a great branding and marketing opportunity. And then finally, from JJ Huggins of Patagonia, one of the world leaders in manufacturing and retail for the outdoors. So you'll hear more about what their involvement in this is. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Clerk Shane Scholler, the elected clerk of Greene County in Southwest Missouri. Since Shane was young, he felt a call to public service. Shane had the opportunity to live his call to service on the staffs of both Roy Blunt and John Ashcroft, and he really found his passion for election administration while he was working for Secretary of State Matt Blunt. Then, as a state representative, Shane served in the legislature as Speaker Pro Tem and then as Speaker of the House. He later served as Executive Director of the Missouri Republican Party. And even though he lost his statewide run for Secretary of State, since elections were his passion, he was able to run and win and serve now as the clerk of Greene County. Part of those duties are overseeing elections. Very relevant to our work today, he was appointed by Senator Blunt to the U.S. Election Assistance Commission Board of Advisors, where he's a national leader with an on-the-ground perspective. Senator Blunt called him to testify in the Senate Rules Committee, which is the committee we are working with, back in 2018 on the critical issue of cybersecurity in our elections, which I think Shane might mention today. Shane is going to share with us today the challenges facing local election authorities like himself, what's at stake, including the worst case scenario for what we could see with our elections and the pandemic and the state of the country. But what the opportunity is if we get involved and work together to do something about it to prevent a disaster and ensure that we have safe, secure, credible elections. Ladies and gentlemen, Shane Scholler.
All right, well, thank you, Benjamin. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with everyone this afternoon. And also just want to thank each of the businesses that are out there. I often just like to make mention that we are gratified by the hard work that you do every day. The taxpayers, the entity which funds the government comes through our businesses. And so I just want to thank you first and foremost. And as we've been talking about, what has happened this year, clearly we've had some very unexpected challenges this year in election administration. As I was telling Benjamin earlier, really the focus early on was cybersecurity. For the past year and a half, that has been our focus. It still is a focus, and I'll talk about that a little bit here at the end. But clearly this year, we had that unexpected challenge called COVID-19 that introduced itself early. Even during our March 10th presidential preference primary, we began to see evidence of it affecting election turnout, even during that election. And we have, since that time, even for that election, we made preparations then as we continue to make preparations going to the August election on the 4th, and then, of course, November 3rd for the presidential general election. And so, but one of the things that I always mention to our election judges that I think is critical is that when voters come to vote, they either gain confidence or keep the confidence they have in their elected form of government, or they lose it. And the reason I mention that is because if there's something that goes wrong, if the lines are too long that disallow someone from being able to vote easily, especially those people who can't stand for long periods of time, that begins to create a sense of dissatisfaction as voters see themselves disenfranchised. And so one of the things that we've truly embraced as election officials across the state and really across the country is the importance that we conduct the election well. Because I think anytime you think about government laws and regulations, they have to be certain in terms of clear, concise. They should not be opaque. People ought to be able to understand the laws that they have to live by. And that's especially true with elections. And so one of the things that we found very early on as we began to think about COVID-19 and people being in the public and their personal health, and that was the issue that we had in our state in particular, was that our excuses didn't clearly cover COVID-19. We had one excuse number 2, which is a health-related excuse. But you either had to be sick or someone that has a disability that would prevent you from being able to go to the polling location, and that would only affect you and your caretaker. So for someone who has a high risk in terms of if they contract COVID-19, it could do real potential harm to their health. There really wasn't anything in our absentee voting laws that covered them. And so one of the things that we began to see very quickly as we left the March election and we started approaching the April election, which eventually we worked to get changed to June, was that different election officials across the state were interpreting excuse number 2 differently. And so we went to the legislature and said, it's really important that voters have a clear reason if they should not be putting themselves in harm's way in terms of their health when they go to vote. As I say, protect the voter, protect the vote. And so they passed, they're literally like the last bill that they passed in the legislature was Senate Bill 631. And it added the 7th excuse. And so if you're in the high risk category as defined by the CDC guidelines, so if you're 65 or over, if you, for example, have lung disease, heart disease, liver disease, you're immunocompromised, those reasons that are there that have been given by the legislature through the CDC guidelines, you can actually use that excuse and you don't have to get a notarized ballot like you would all the other excuses. And the reason that's important is excuse number 2 does not have a notary either. And the reason it doesn't have a notary is if you're sick, you don't want to get someone else sick during that time period. And so we were really grateful they did that. But there's also what I call the good neighbor, the person who travels and you think about business, you interact with people quite a bit, you may be in and out of the state. You realize that probably you're interacting with more people than not. And so you'd really like to avoid a polling location day of the election because you yourself might have contracted COVID and have no idea of it and be a carrier. And so they also added in the mail-in ballot option. And so what that does for the voter is that they can request by mail or in person, the ballot be mailed to them, and then they vote that ballot, they get the ballot notarized, and then they send it back by mail. And that gives an option to voters that for those who wouldn't be covered underneath the 7th excuse, they can also avoid going to their local polling location, which I think is really critical in terms of this time period. They sunset it for this year, December 31st, so it's only for 1 year that this law will be in effect. But the reason that that was important was that it now gives us the certainty to be able to conduct the election, and it helps us, hopefully on election day, have less voters at each polling location across each of our counties. Because one of the challenges that you've seen in other states is when they've lost polling location, they've lost election judges, what happens is you get a high turnout at these reduced polling locations, and that increases the challenges you have in terms of being able to, one, make sure every voter gets to vote, and two, making sure the voters stay socially distanced while they're there. And so right now, for example, Greene County, we plan to have all of our polling locations open. We're working to make sure we have all the election judges that we need. But we realize things can change very quickly. And so part of helping make sure that we can serve voters well is that more voters that can vote by mail, better off that we're going to be in terms of the election day experience. Now, we can't have every voter vote by mail either. And that's one of the challenges that we realize in thinking about each election. And that is, one, we're not set up to be able to vote every voter by mail and do it effectively. Matter of fact, the Secretary of State from Washington, the state had said, you know, it took them a number of years to become a vote by mail state, and she didn't recommend that a state return to that overnight. That if you're going to become a vote by mail state, you need to do it in phases and be able to do it well. Because one, we're not able to do it, and to be frank, in talking with the U.S. Postal Service, they're not prepared to do it either in this region of the country. And so those are things that have factored into it. But because the legislature did that, we can now more effectively administer the election. However, there's increased cost. And as you know, we've seen it affect our businesses. But the one thing that we really don't have the luxury of for election administration is, and I'm talking to Benjamin about this, I've yet to see one story when the election was not administered well during this year where the press was sympathetic. They expect it to be administered just like any other election, regardless of the challenges that a local election official faces. So, as I say, what we can't do is we can't give, you know, for example, if you try to buy or build a Cadillac on a Chevette budget, you're going to get a Chevette. And so, I don't know if y'all remember the Chevette days, but as a kid, I remember riding those when mom and dad bought one. They weren't that comfortable. It was by no means the Cadillac experience. As election officials, we want to give voters the best experience that they can have when they come to vote. And so one of the things that we've had to do is, for example, election judges. The normal people that serve as election judges are often our seniors, and they're not going to be available like they have been in the past because, frankly, they should not be out in the public and they need to protect their health. And so, for example, hazard pay for every election judge between now and November, we're going to pay an additional $85 per election to make sure that they're able, you know, to be well compensated for, in essence, in some ways, putting themselves at risk there the day of the election. Because, you know, the hardest challenge about COVID-19 is you don't know who has it. Many people are willing to take that risk. We want to make sure they're well compensated for it. So the minimum election judge will make if they do training is $220, and then it goes on up from there for supervisory judges. So that was important. But then the other thing is election night. If we get a number of absentee ballots that we're thinking about November, we needed to make sure that we can still tabulate all the election results on the night of the election and not leave open that window where suddenly we have more ballots than we could process leading up to the night of the election, and we can't get those ballots processed through the election equipment. So one of the things we purchased was a high-speed scanner, and that's not a small expense, and normally I never would have made that purchase. But what we want to be able to do is make sure that on the night of the election that, you know, after 7 o'clock when the polls close, we can begin to release the results. Of course, they're uncertified. They're not certified till about 10 days later on average for most election officials. We want to make sure that those results are at least on the night of the election. You can look at every precinct in your county and you get a good idea of what happened in each precinct for your county, including the absentee results. So that was another thing that we purchased. And then another thing that was not inexpensive was Plexiglas Shields. We want to make sure that for the election judge and the voter that we had that Plexiglas shield like you've seen at your supermarkets and various places as you went out to make sure if there's that accidental sneeze that they're protected. So those are our three main expenses. The other one that we're seeing is that polling locations are asking us to have a professional cleaning. And so that's an additional expense that we have, is they want to make sure that after we leave, the polling location is clean. So all of those things, as you can imagine, take funding. Senator Blunt was in here a couple of days ago and we had a good chance to visit. And I told him at a minimum, we're probably about $60,000 short of where we need to be. We got one round of funding, I think in the third round of COVID-19 funding from Congress. But in order to be able to make sure that we can do everything and do it well, we really probably need at a minimum $60,000. And frankly, with the cleaning charges we're seeing, could be closer to 85,000 by the end of it. However, I'm conservative. And I've told this as I've talked to people in Washington, if we don't use the money, we need to send it back. And I think that's important, that we are accountable for those funds. And we've been having those conversations with people in Washington during this time period. But Senator Blunt, one of the things that I think he has stated publicly, and he mentioned again when we visited a couple of days ago, and that is what we don't need to do is put election policy in with election funding. Those are good conversations to have. I'm always open to those conversations, but you cannot, I think we're 117 days out from the November 3rd election. You can't suddenly make huge adjustments to election policy leading up to an election. There has to be time to be able to implement those well. And Senator Blunt understands that. He actually held his position. He was county clerk. That was where he began his start in politics, right here in Greene County. So we're really fortunate he's in the role he is as the chairman of the Senate Rules Committee. Of course, he was Secretary of State as well. So he has, I think, a very unique perspective that most people in Congress do not have. And so I think that has served us well. And so we really appreciated his leadership, how he has put forth that he understands the need for funding. And what we're hoping is that, partisanship can be set aside so that we can have the funding we need to be able to make sure that we can administer a safe, secure election. Because I mentioned earlier, one of the things we have to be cognizant of is if things fall apart during an election, we've already seen this year what has been happening in terms of riots. People are more willing than any time in my lifetime that I've lived to be able to go out and demonstrate. And as we've seen, sometimes that has become violent in terms of the demonstrations. We don't need that for this election. I mean, elections are about certainty. That's what our founding fathers understood. They understood that we should resolve our differences at the ballot box. Frankly, that's something that we need to continue to do. And Senator Blunt, of course, he understands that. But we, one, need to make sure the election is well. But secondly, we need to make sure we're not giving those foreign actors who have bad intentions the opportunity to come in and compromise, for example, our voter registration systems, how we check in voters. Frankly, that's more of a concern for me of them hacking into our voter registration system than even it is the election equipment itself. Very hard to hack into the election equipment and change a vote. Much easier to be able to hack into the voter registration system. If you look back what happened in 2016, they were hacking into the voter registration systems. So those are things that we keep at the forefront. This is why we want to make sure that we can fund this election and continue to keep our eye on, one, making sure that every voter and their vote is safe, but also that we do things on the cybersecurity end that we need to be doing that we were prepared for as we led up to 2020 and not forget those as well. So I think I probably went along than I should there, Benjamin, but hopefully that kind of encapsulates what we've talked about here in the past few days.
Thank you, Shane. No, that was a lot of fantastic background. Thank you for helping us understand what's really happening on the ground and what could hopefully be done. We'll hear more about those solutions in a moment in terms of what's happening in DC. It is very scary to think about what could happen if you and the other 115 local election authorities in Missouri and the thousands of LEAs around the country don't get the resources you need to run safe, secure, credible elections in terms of the unrest and potentially pandemic increases we could see across the country. So looking forward to doing something about that. So on that note, I'll introduce the CEO of Business for America, Sarah Bonk. Bonk, take it away.
Thank you so much, Benj, and thank you to the whole Show Me Integrity team. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to everyone who's joining us online. Before Business for America, I spent about 20 years working in design, technology, and leadership. So I come from the business realm, like most of everybody who's joining us today. Large part of that was in Ohio at American Electric Power, which I'm sure some of you have heard of, and then nearly 15 years at Apple in California, where I remain today. So while I was at Apple, it was towards the end of my professional business career, I got involved with nonpartisan groups focused on the health of our republic, looking at a lot of different issues around how our democracy functions. And what I recognized was that no one was adequately making the business and economic arguments for our representative democracy. And that was why I founded Business for America. It's based on the idea that the interest of the public and the interests of business are aligned on having a well-functioning representative democracy, and that we all deserve elections that we can trust, and having chaotic elections and the hyper-partisanship, the polarization, that hurts all of us, whether it's our business interests or our personal interests. So Business for America is a national nonpartisan nonprofit business organization with business members. We're focused exclusively on how we can help strengthen representative democracy, and we do that by helping to boost voter participation, ensuring election integrity, and reducing political polarization. So you're going to hear more later from Mark and Sarah about why business cares, but I wanted to kind of boil it down for you. We see it comes down to two main categories of why. The first is the business reason, that when we are trying to run businesses and generate profit and bring products to market and improve our services, and dysfunctional government that is failing to solve problems and failing to address issues that we need to have addressed, it's hurting our economy. It's sometimes hurting our business directly. So we have both a direct self-interest in having a functioning political system, as well as an enlightened self-interest of having an economy that's working well overall. But in addition to the self-interest, we also care about our employees, our customers, the communities where we operate. We want them to be heard. A lot of us feel as business leaders that have been successful in the American economy that we have a duty to preserve the institutions that allow us to be entrepreneurs, to create new enterprises, and to be successful. We've done well while doing good in America, and we have a duty to ensure that others have that opportunity as well. So you have a good picture already of what election officials need and why. They need funding, they need resources right now. And just like we want to do our jobs well, our public officials do too. Something I've been saying is no one wants to have the hanging chads of 2020. Most of us lived through that. We want to get through this election with confidence that the vote was correct. And we believe that with the right investment, that every state has the capacity to deliver elections that are safe, secure, accessible, and accurate, and that none of these things need to be at odds with each other. When we follow the best practices and let people do their jobs and give them the resources to do that, this is entirely possible. The thing that's missing right now is the political will to ensure that they get those resources. Of course, business can have an outsized voice in this process and can make a big difference in providing that bipartisanship and persuasion that this is what needs to get done, and ASAP. So what we're asking today, Business for America and Show Me Integrity are asking businesses to join us in helping to ensure that voting in the 2020 election is safe and the results are accurate and everyone gets to participate who has the right to participate by, first of all, signing our nonpartisan letter to Congress. This is basically a letter in support of the funding to ensure that states can expand their absentee voting operations as described, as well as ensure that physical polling places are run safely. So that letter is at bfa.us. And you can also, if you've already signed, I know some of you have, you can ask your colleagues to sign the letter as well. We're going to have a series of follow-on meetings with some senators, especially our friend Senator Roy Blunt. And Richard's going to step you through that in a second here. But I really quickly want to give you the heads up on another opportunity, and that is to provide direct support of election officials through your business. First of all, you may have employees that are interested in being civically engaged and may wish to become poll workers. They may wish to help with ballot counting operations and other functions that election officials need support with. There's also a need for supplies. Some places are still short on masks and sanitation and cleaning equipment, and others could use assistance with information and getting out, being a trusted source of information and fighting disinfo to ensure that voters really know what's going on election day. So we are calling that Operation Vote Safe. You can also find more information about that at bfa.us. And of course, you can reach out to me, Bonk, at bfa.us if that interests you. We certainly will be following up with you and Show Me Integrity as we provide this direct support in Missouri. We're pretty excited about it. So with that, we're going to get back into the politics of what we're doing to persuade some senators to see our point of view on this. And I'm going to hand it off to Richard Eidlin, who is Business for America's National Policy Director. Richard, why don't you take it away?
Great. Thank you, Bonk. And thanks, Benj, for helping pull this together. So, one of the key considerations here in why Missouri is so important is that Senator Blunt, as you may know, all may know, is the chair of the Senate Rules Committee, which has jurisdiction over election-related issues. So the senator is really front and center on this critical issue. And currently, just a little background, the U.S. House of Representatives approved a bill recently called the HEROES Act, which was essentially a large stimulus initiative that would have funded all kinds of things. And that was a several $trillion piece of legislation. Within that bill is a provision calling for $3.6 billion out of several $1 trillion to be distributed to the states across the country for exactly what Shane was describing, to support states and by extension local election officials to administer their election in a safe and secure and credible manner. So here comes the political angle or the aspect of it. There is, not surprisingly, a difference of opinion between Democrats and Republicans in the House and now in the Senate as to how those funds would be used. The Democrats, and I'm generalizing here, believe there should be some requirements, some standards, some best practices adopted. And generally speaking, Republicans have said we do not want to federalize the election and that the distribution of these funds and their use should be decided upon by state and local election officials who know better or best how those monies are needed and what the best use of those funds are. And that debate is a very active one in Congress right now. Right now, the Senate and the House are on recess, and they come back on July 20th, when it's expected, maybe on the 22nd of the month, there'll be a hearing in Senator Blunt's Rules Committee. And that hearing will discuss the COVID crisis and elections. The details of who's going to be testifying are not clear yet, but it's likely to be an interesting conversation about, number one, whether there is in fact a need for more money. And most election officials across the country, including Shane, describe there is in fact an urgent need, and this is a functional challenge of election officials. This is not a partisan issue for election officials. Senator Mitch McConnell, the majority leader in the U.S. Senate, has been indicating a willingness and understanding that a final stimulus package probably is necessary, and that could be anywhere from $2 to $3 trillion. But Senator McConnell has not committed to support the additional distribution of funds for election-related issues. Senator Blunt has expressed an understanding also that additional funding is needed for election operations, but he has expressed a lot of skepticism about expanded vote by mail, which is a key priority for the Democrats in the Senate and in the House. So long story short, it probably looks as though funding will be provided by the Senate and the House in some compromise. Not everyone's going to be happy, that's for sure, because the Democrats will probably not get the more prescriptive set of actions they would like the Congress to dictate or direct to the states. And Republicans understanding, hearing in particular from local election officials, but also from business people, that additional funding is necessary, they'll probably compromise. And I'll just close here with a thought that, the business case that we've been making across the country in talking to companies like Patagonia and Warby Parker and Cox Enterprises is, as Bonk noted, businesses are really concerned about having effective operational practices in place. Businesses are customer-centric and want the customer, i.e. the voter, or in the case of the business, the consumer, to have a positive experience. And reflecting back on Shane's comment, no credible business would mistreat its customers because that diminishes faith in that company, diminishes the trust and the relationship that that business has with its customers. So we're essentially trying to bring a business perspective to this issue about funding. And we are looking to have a meeting with Senator Blunt or his staff the week of July 20th. We're eager to have you all participate in that meeting. It'll be a video call or at least a telephone call, and to be able to express your specific concerns about the need for additional funding. And so I'll leave it there and happy to answer any questions that anyone has. Thanks, Benj.
Thank you, Richard, for the helpful intelligence, and to Bonk, both of you for helping us understand what businesses can do. So let's hear briefly from a couple of business leaders here in Missouri on why they believe more businesses need to get involved in this. First, we're going to hear from Mark Burgess. So Mark Burgess is the owner of Burgess Aircraft Management, also known as OzAir Charter Service, the largest on-demand air carrier business in Southwest Missouri. He and his large aviation staff operate 10 jet aircraft all over the United States, the Caribbean, Canada, and Mexico. Obviously, the pandemic presents an interesting time for the aviation business. And so Mark and then Sarah after that will talk about why they believe more businesses need to get involved and why this is so critical for business and our economy. Mark, the floor is all yours.
Okay, I hope we got everything unmuted here for you. So thanks for having me, Benj, and everybody else. The two biggest things that come full screen for us anyway is financially, the COVID-19 pandemic basically shut us down. We were not operating any flights for probably about 2 months. The PPP money obviously helped us get through that, helped us maintain our staff. But if we go through another round of that, I don't think that's going to make it. Number one, I don't see how the government can fund that kind of money back to us a second time. And also the fact that we were able to not furlough anybody off and keep them without that PPP money, that wouldn't have been capable. So the last thing we want is another outgrowth of the pandemic, another opportunity for it to happen with exposure at voting places and polls, things like that. A lot of my people don't get exposed to that. My staff, a lot of us vote absentee, myself included. It's easy, it's convenient, and because we do medevac type flights and things, our schedule kind of dictates that we need to vote that way. So we obviously know that works. We know absentee works. We know vote at home works. You just have to get right past that hurdle. So the other thing comes around to strictly a non-bipartisan issue, and this was alluded to earlier. In my opinion, you're going to have the same situation again, no matter who wins or who loses in this situation. If it's not fairly clean and above board, you're going to have riots in the street. And no matter which party wins or loses, the other party's going to think they got hosed. And so you can't get in a situation again to where people feel like they were disenfranchised or interrupted from voting. And again, getting people to come work the polling places and being afraid of the pandemic, all these things come into play. So we have to get to a point of having safe, secure elections, people feel comfortable getting to the polling places, and be able to be open long enough and have enough facilities up that everybody gets the opportunity. Because as was said earlier about the hanging Chad situation, that was a minor glitch in one state. And it was in the Supreme Court, and they were arguing about it, and we were several months before it all got taken care of. I mean, we just can't be doing that, not right now, not with everything else going on. And I think with the racial tensions we have right now, with the political tensions we have, the financial tensions we have, the last thing you do is pile on this as one more item. And I can see both parties screaming and yelling at the top of their lungs if things don't go in their favor, that it was a fraudulent election. So the more we can do to avoid another shutdown economically and financially on us, and the more we can do to make sure that everybody gets a chance to place their votes, there's as little turmoil as we can have at the end of this election cycle, the better it is for all of us concerned.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate you sharing that. Yeah, obviously, as you were alluding to, and as Shane said, with the temperature of the country as it is right now, and as you and Bonk both said, if we had a hanging Chad situation, God knows what would happen. So now I'd like to introduce Sarah Schlafly. So Sarah Schlafly is the founder and CEO of Mighty Cricket, building a clean protein supply to sustain the world. Sarah's background includes accounting and 10 years in the food industry, including marketing for a national food brand. Sarah has a passion for nutrition, food equity, and the culinary arts. She was selected by Inc. magazine as a top military entrepreneur, and later chosen by the St. Louis Business Journal last year in the 30 under 30. But I happen to know that Sarah had a birthday a couple weeks ago, so now she's probably working on her 40 under 40. So, ladies and gentlemen, Sarah Schlafly.
Thanks so much, Benj. I really appreciate how you emphasize both L's, Schlafly. That's awesome. So here at Mighty Cricket, we see this opportunity to sign on this letter as a really great marketing opportunity for us. From a business standpoint, I look at other businesses and the way they operate in light of COVID. And when I walk into certain stores and see that they're wiping down counters, it makes me feel very comfortable being in that business. Then I go into other places like the gym that I was a part of, and I wasn't seeing that same level of care and concern about the pandemic. And I just felt uncomfortable enough that I ended up canceling my membership. So putting on my social enterprise hat, I realized that I can apply this also to my company, Mighty Cricket, and start promoting the Safe Vote initiative by voting via ballot. And that's just a great tie-in to our brand to show our customers that we really care about the health, wellness, and safety of our customers, to the point that we're going to go out of our way to promote this issue that is external to Mighty Cricket. So for us, attaching this to our brand helps share that message that we are into wellness. And also a huge piece of Mighty Cricket is about equity. Mighty Cricket was founded on the idea that we wanted to build a highly equitable, clean source of protein. And I also view vote by mail as an equity issue, and being able to get people, no matter what life situation they're in, whether they're having health issues, as someone earlier mentioned, standing the polls could be a challenge. With the pandemic, a lot of elderly people might be worried about venturing out and having those interactions. And so if we're excluding these people from the vote, that is the most unequitable thing we could do for our nation. So tying our brand to that piece as well is huge for Mighty Cricket. Lastly, I think that it attracts brand loyalty from a younger customer. And Mighty Cricket is our biggest customer base is millennials and soon to be Gen Z as they age into the market, because those are the people who are leading the future of clean protein and the most adventurous in consuming a product made with cricket protein. So Mighty Cricket is literal. So I think that this initiative is a really great bipartisan way to attract a younger audience. Polls show that 70% of Americans want the option to vote by mail, and lots of Republicans and Democratic governors and secretaries of state are promoting this. Missouri's legislators passed a law for it. More red, blue, and purple states vote by mail, like Utah, Alaska, Florida, and Oregon. And like Mark said, studies show that it doesn't benefit either political party more than the other. So for Mighty Cricket, if a brand is worried about taking a stance versus being like left or right winged, this is a perfect issue to tie on to that both parties can agree on.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing that. We're going to jump into Q&A now for our business leaders, as well as our policy experts and our local election authority now. We've covered a lot of ground. So before we hand it over to JJ Huggins from Patagonia, we want to take a moment and answer any questions from any business leaders on the call who might have questions about what we're dealing with, about the issues, about the opportunities. So, Shane, you mentioned that there's going to be some additional costs in recruiting poll workers. I remember seeing something about how, a vast majority of poll workers are over age 60. So I can understand why $85 in hazard pay might be the least you can do in terms of, an at-risk population who usually work in the polls. What's the need there? What do you expect the scale of that to be in terms of funding needed, but also the number of people, in case businesses are able to mobilize maybe some of their younger employees to help out? What are the dynamics there in terms of the challenges and opportunities?
And one of the reasons it's interesting that we have found as we looked at this is you actually need more election judges during this time than less. And one of the reasons why is because you need to keep people socially distanced, so you need to make sure there's enough lines for people to get into. But for example, here in Greene County, we're going to have one person that's just cleaning the entire day, the hard services, making sure that the pens are clean, making sure they're doing all those things. Then we have one person communicating to the voters as they come in, because one of the things we find is it's a lot easier, even though we'll have the place markers there to keep people distance, people seem to ignore those. And so you have to kind of remind people, hey, make sure you're standing apart from each other as you're there during that day. Because some voters can get very anxious very quickly. And so you want to be able to de-escalate those situations if they feel like people are getting too close to them. And so there'll be one person out with that. But for example, just for hazard pay in August, we're going to need, we're going to be $250 short of $47,000. That's just the additional pay of $85 per election judge, because we'll have in the field almost 500 election judges for Greene County alone. And of course, you think about there in St. Louis County where you're at, Minge, that's significant cost for them. And I don't know what they're paying, but I believe they're paying more there as well. And then for November, we'll need more because we still anticipate a very heavy turnout, even with the vote by mail option. And so for November, we're going to need over $55,000 just to be able to handle that. I see a question there. The question is there any evidence that voting by mail is less secure, more susceptible to fraud than in-person voting? What I always like to tell people is if somebody wants to commit fraud, they'll commit it, whether it's in person, whether it's by mail. They will figure out a way to be able to manipulate the system that they have. And that's why we have to be careful when we have these conversations. Yes, vote by mail is one. area. Matter of fact, in 2005, you may remember there was a commission put together that President Jimmy Carter was a co-chair of, and then James Baker, who had worked for the Bush administration, had been, I believe, Secretary of State, he was a co-chair of. They did identify in that report that, absentee voting is probably one of the biggest areas of fraud that they noted of concern when they did that report. However, since that time, one of the things that has come a long way is signature verification technology. That's one of the things that myself and I know other election officials across the state would like to see increased funding, not only for the technology, but also for the training. Those are things we can do. For example, notaries. There's one state where the political operatives became notaries. And of course, a notary basically acts like an election judge. They're verifying who that voter is. But unfortunately, they thought, well, we'll just become a notary. And the list of people who get absentee ballots is actually public information for political parties and candidates. And then they went and knocked on the door of those people who got the absentee ballots and helped them fill out the ballot. And unfortunately, a lot of those people that get absentee ballots are often elderly. And so they think that person is there to assist them. So, but in-person voting, we look at our state, our history going back to the Pendergast era. It is at least a few years ago when I looked at it, it's the biggest case of voter fraud ever, of in-person voter fraud, where people were voting for other people during the day of an election back in the 1930s. Of course, that's years ago. That's a couple of years after. That's why voter ID became part of the voting experience, to make sure a voter identified him or herself when they came to vote. So there's a lot of different ways to be able to manipulate an election in terms of voter fraud. And as an election official, we do all we can to make sure that we prevent that in terms of, one, properly IDing the voter, and when it comes to the vote by mail, making sure that the signature's there, the correct address is there, all those things that are important. And one of the things I'd like to see, and I'll kind of close with this, is we need to have a conversation about probably including ID in return ballots by mail. Other states have done that have went to vote by mail, and I think that's a good conversation to have as we begin to trend more towards vote by mail.
Yeah, let me just, Ben, let me just add something to that. Concerning this issue of the potential for fraud with vote by mail, I think Sarah Schlafly noted that there are 5 states that have an entire vote by mail system in the United States, and those are Utah, Hawaii, Washington, Oregon, and Colorado. So in those states, there is literally no evidence of vote by mail fraud. And there, as Shane noted, a very sophisticated signature verification or curing process that exists in those states. So the operational procedures can in fact be put in place in every state. Not every state has the same approach, that's for sure. But there really is, in the past 10, 15 years, very little evidence. And for those of you who are interested of voter fraud from vote by mail, and of those of you who want to dig into this, you might go to our website, bfa.us. There's a tab there that has videos. And it's a somewhat longish 18-minute video that Bonk conducted an interview with Washington's Secretary of State, Kim Wyman. Secretary Wyman is elected Republican, so she's, she has a political point of view on this, but she goes through in quite a bit of detail, answering the journalistic, investigative approach that Bonk took about trying to ferret out fraud. So that might be worth checking into, everybody, for a little bit more detail. So thanks, Benji. I just wanted to offer that.
Absolutely, and I think that gets to another big point that Shane made, which is not changing policies drastically at the last minute, because the states that have strong vote by mail, and have, little to no evidence of any fraud are that way because they have a lot of strong protections in place. Here in Missouri, thank goodness, we have really strong penalties for any voter fraud. I think it's $10,000 per instance loss of voting privileges for life, loss of voting rights for life, and time in prison as well. So that's fortunately one reason that we see so little voter fraud, but there have been issues, especially with notaries in Missouri sometimes in terms of gathering those up. So notarization is definitely an area that we have, but has opened the door to some potential foul play that we can hopefully address in the future. But again, this topic and what we want everyone to sign on to, as you can see the website here, this letter is not advocating for any of those policy changes. We're not taking a position on vote by mail or no vote by mail. This is just about getting funding to election authorities around Missouri and across the country to do what they already know how to do, to administer the laws the way they are and ensure that we can have safe, secure, credible elections so that we don't have just, potentially an unbelievable eruption of riots in this country if we have uncredible elections. So let's move on. We're almost out of time and we have the speaker I'm really excited to hear from. And thank you again to Eric Bronner of the Bronner Soap extended family for those questions. So we'll move on to JJ Huggins of Patagonia, PR and communications department there. And he is the point person for the National Nonpartisan Time to Vote Initiative. So JJ, I'm going to send it over to you. But again, since we might run out of time while you're talking and we might lose some people, just one last reminder, if you want to sign on to the letter, go to bfa.us. We are trying to get to 50 Missouri businesses to join the 150 other businesses by the end of the day, July 17th. We'll have follow-up meeting with Senator Blunt with some of the folks who sign on to that letter. So please sign on to have that opportunity to join that call with Senator Blunt. We'll have social media opportunities for you all for branding purposes. There's Operation Vote Safe, which Bonk mentioned earlier. So wanted to get those in, again, bfa.us to sign that bipartisan letter. So JJ, with no further ado, please take it away.
Thank you, Benj. I'll keep it quick. Thank you all for being on this webinar. And Patagonia is a proud signatory of the Vote Safe letter. We are also a leader of the Time to Vote movement, and Time to Vote is a coalition of companies who have pledged to give their employees time to vote in this fall's election. We have 562 companies who have signed on to Time to Vote now. This includes major corporations such as Visa, Walmart, Target, Best Buy, all the way on down through your local mom and pop brick and mortar stores. And we need more companies, especially from the middle of the country, places like Missouri. So please go to maketimetovote.org. Check it out. There's a simple form you can fill out on our website to apply for Time to Vote. Joining is free. And when you join Time to Vote, the ask is simple. We are asking you to pledge to give your employees the time or the resources they need to vote in this fall's election. Like at Mark's company, where most of them vote via absentee ballot, that could be something as simple as reminding your employees to fill out their absentee ballot, maybe giving them time on the clock if they need that. Patagonia closes on election day. It's a paid holiday. We've seen a number of companies announce that they're taking similar initiatives this year, but you don't have to take it to that extreme. Most companies just give their employees 2 to 3 hours of time off on election day. Again, it's maketimetovote.org. And my email, if anybody has any questions, is John, JOHN.Huggins, HUGGINS at Patagonia.com. Be happy to speak with anyone about Time to Vote. Thank you.
Thank you, JJ. We have a couple great questions as well from David, the CEO of the Warehouse of Fixtures. How can you use ID and vote by mail? That can be done by mailing back a copy of your ID with your request or your ballot. Thank you, Shane, for weighing in on that. Currently, that's required if you registered online, so you've never showed your ID in person. You have to send your ID with your ballot request. And we have a question from Alex as well. So I think this is a great question for Business for America and some of the business leaders on the call.
Sure. So yeah, Alex's question is, that election officials across the country face budget shortfalls and a lack of resources that are necessary to provide safe, smooth, and secure elections in this election cycle. Yeah, they sure do, understatement. And what role can the private sector play in ensuring communities have the resources they need to ensure their elections run well? And that is what we're calling Operation Vote Safe. So we are currently working with election officials in a number of states to understand their needs, where business may be able to contribute. And that's the supply side or the demand side. And then on the supply side, we are talking to businesses that want to chip in. And that may be having some of your employees as poll workers and ballot counters, facilities that could be used for voting centers, helping with PPE. Some states are still facing a shortfall in terms of supplies and equipment, and potentially even helping with marketing and communications around combating disinfo and making sure voters have the information they need to vote. So you can find more, of course, at bfa.us and get in touch with us. We would love to involve you and help the business community making a difference in this election.
Thank you, Bonk. Well, I think that is all we have today. Want to make sure we don't have any questions left. It looks like not. So again, please sign on at bfa.us. It's a bipartisan letter, already has 150 corporations, chambers of commerce, business executives from across the country, some of the largest corporations in the country like Unilever, all the way down to mom and pop shops and startups. So thank you to Sarah Schlafly, the CEO of Mighty Cricket. Thank you to Clerk Shane Scholler from Greene County. Thank you to Mark Burgess, the owner of Burgess Aircraft Management, for all of your Southwest Missouri charter air travel needs. Thank you so much to JJ Huggins from Patagonia for joining us today. And of course, a huge thanks to Bonk and Richard at Business for America for helping lead the charge from within the private sector and the business community to help make our elections great and ensure that we have safe, secure, credible elections so that we can help get past this pandemic, ensure we have the stability for our economy that our country desperately needs.